Good morning, everybody. We'd love to invite you to find a seat if you can. Because we're in Episcopal, we're doing very well. There are only a few seats at the front, but there are seats at the front. So please do make use of every open seat. We'll get started in just a minute. You have never been this well disciplined before. There's something going on. This is very good. But do find a seat, and there are more seats we can put out. So certainly if you want to be seated for this, we certainly can do that. We'll get started in just a couple of minutes. Well, good morning, everybody. Delighted that we can share this time together. I'm going to offer some words of introduction to two people who you might say do not need any introduction. I do want to say that they were rightly complimenting each other on how beautifully they're dressed, and I had to draw attention to myself. I picked this Advent blue blazer especially, but let me offer some words of introduction that are really an act of thanksgiving for two people who are a beloved part of this community. To my immediate right, Sally Yates, former Deputy Attorney General of the United States and a partner at King & Spalding's Special Matters and Government Investigations practice, where she leads the firm's crisis management practice. As the second highest ranking official of the US Department of Justice and as acting Attorney General, Sally was responsible, this part made me sweat, for all of the DOJ's 113,000 employees whom you met on an individual basis, including all prosecutorial, litigating and national security components. Her practice today focuses on government enforcement and regulatory matters, congressional investigations, of which I'm sure there are none, compliance, corporate governance, and crisis management. Sally is a longtime parishioner of All Saints, married to Coma Yates, and parents of two adult children, Kelly and Quill. We're so glad that you're with us. Sally, would you offer a warm round of applause for Sally Yates? And to Sally's right is one of my partners in crime here at All Saints.
No crime in front of Sally.
No crime, that's right. Minister for Public Life at All Saints. A leadership role that supports our mission as a parish to seek and serve Christ in all persons and pursue what it means to honor the dignity of every human being in the world around us, and it's a great gift for these years of ministry that we've shared. Natosha's ministry, in many ways, is the future of the church. It is bivocational. Beyond her church work, she's a global leader for Habitat for Humanity International, which operates in over 70 countries worldwide. Before joining All Saints, Natosha served as associate pastor for women's ministries at Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta. Would you offer a warm round of applause for Natosha Reid Rice? One of the great gifts of being ordained is that you're meant to know nothing about anything in particular, and so we're sort of expert in nothing. And I offer a framing for a huge conversation today about the future of the law or the rule of law, which is something I'm absolutely unqualified to talk about. But we've been thinking about a series of big ideas in this three-part forum series. The first one with Richard Rothstein and Natosha and I, diversity, equity, inclusion. Where are those three words heading? Where is our society and our world heading as we think about themes that were so much part of the news cycle just a couple of years ago. In our last session, we looked at the idea of art as sacred resistance. And we're joined by Isha Penniman, artist and resident here at All Saints. And today, that small topic of the rule of law. And I wanted to explore these big ideas in recognition that we're living, to state the obvious, in a transitional time. From a previous age of norms and practices in society and across the world into a new age whose nature is still coming into view. The basic premise of us wanting to do this is that I believe that a life of faith that confesses that God so loved the world needs to try to understand that world and ask how our faith informs our life within it. So it is a massive topic, and we could be here for hours, but I've tried to frame this conversation through the biblical theme of covenants, 3 covenants in particular. And I'd like to start with what's sometimes called the covenant of progeny. So think of this as sort of quality assurance for your Sunday school teacher back in the day. There's a beautiful line in the 26th chapter of Deuteronomy, one of my favorites in the Bible. You probably have heard it before. A wandering Aramaean was my ancestor. And scholars believe that's probably pre-biblical in its origins, spoken in acts of worship, and it's said today by Jews as they mark the Passover Seder. And it expresses this idea that Israel has nomadic roots, and its origin story is a people made up of many peoples. You may remember that story in the Bible of Abram being shown the stars in the sky and asked to try and count them. Such will be your progeny, your descendants, unable to count how many and varied they are. And this idea that the people of God are plural, are many, is reaffirmed in Paul's theology, the theology, if you like, that we belong to. The nature of the church is that it is for Jew and Gentile, which really means everyone. So our faith orients us to a basic human question, which is, how are we to live with one another? So I want to turn that question to a laws-based society like ours, and ask them that for me sounds like a really basic question. For the non-lawyers in the room, at a high level, how does the law name how Americans should live together? Whoever wants to take it first.
Well, let me first say thank you for this invitation to be here in conversation with you today. You know, when Simon first reached out and asked if I would participate in this discussion about the rule of law, I thought, bunny, I've done this a million times, rule of law, that's going to be easy. And then I got Simon's outline of the discussion for today. And I realized I should not have underestimated Simon. Of course, he was going to bring the kind of insight and nuance to this topic that is missing from our discussions in our society today. So I panicked a bit when I read this outline because it was far different than any of the other discussions I have ever done on the rule of law. But I am grateful to you, Simon, because it has caused me to think a bit more broadly and more deeply about these issues. And that's not just my effort here to stall while I try to avoid your first question, although maybe a little bit of that. But to your question about what the law says about how we are to treat each other as Americans, you know, first let me give another little disclaimer. I am no constitutional scholar. I'm a practitioner as a lawyer. But I think all of us learn from our first days in elementary school about our founding principles. And I think we were founded to be a pluralistic society. We were founded on the concepts of freedom of religion, of freedom of expression and association, and also founded on the concept of equality for all. Now, this concept of equality for all, we haven't exactly lived up to that in a straight line way. While our founding documents talk about all men being created equal, we know that it wasn't until much, much later with the 13th and 14th Amendments, and even today that we still struggle with that. But that, I think, is sort of the framework for our laws that then have been carried out statutorily, whether it's the Civil Rights Act or the Americans with Disabilities Act, all in furtherance of this concept, at least from my perspective, this concept that we are, again, a pluralistic country, and we are bound together by our commitment to these freedoms and to equality, but not bound together by a particular ideology. And in fact, just the opposite of that, that our laws are to protect those, or designed to protect those, who ascribe to an ideology that is in the minority or disfavored. Now, those laws have not also been executed in a perfect way, and we as a society, I think, have not necessarily ascribed to those founding values, but I think we're going to be talking a little bit more about that. And I promise not all the answers will be this long. So.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you.
I'll tag
Yeah.
and say, one, it's so great to be with you and be with Simon. And when Simon sent the framing to me, I was like, I don't practice law anymore. Like, so I'm gonna check this out of the box. But I will say, seriously, so many of you may know, I began preaching my first year of law school. And for me, the conversation that you so brilliantly framed for us to have today really actually is the root of why I feel that the two have always been in tag team. I've never been, Simon mentioned my bivocational or multivocational life. I've never actually been allowed to do just one. And I as I've gotten into this decade of my life, I see even more so why. When we talk about Americans and the rights due to all Americans, when we talk about the inalienable rights, that conversation from the framing of our very nation, it assumes the humanity of certain people and not all. And if we do not deal with the way we approach law with an understanding of how theology and church has informed the humanity or lack of people on the soil of this country, we do a disservice to any conversation about law and theology. It's no mistake that slavery in this country was justified through the church and theology. There's no mistake that the second rise of the KKK came from the financial basis of the Protestant church. If we can show that humanity is a label that is only given to some and not to others, and put God on it, then we're able to say that these are rights for all Americans, and then determine who's American based upon race, birthright, language, ethnicity, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm really shorthanding this whole conversation of how we get into conversations of the oxymoronic Christian nationalism space. It's the only way that we get into conversation. So when we now, as Sally has mentioned, the 13th and 14th Amendment, the profound work of the 14th Amendment was this wonderful invitation for us all to begin having a conversation now about what it looks like to have an America for a pluralistic population. Because it's through that amendment that we get citizenship, birthright citizenship, equal protection under the law. Many will say that's the second founding of our nation, because prior to the 14th Amendment, there were many who were dubbed 3/5 of a human being. And that was considered okay. And how we then came up with legislating voting rights, legislating all these other components that actually become the inalienable rights. So I think, and I'm saying a lot in a very short span of time to say, when we have these framing conversations and look at covenant, when we have framing conversations and we look at the ways in which we have allowed the Bible and its theology to be reframed into actually being anti-God, then we can begin having real conversations about the law and where we are today and how that plays itself out.
Thank you, Natosha. One of the things that I find difficult is keeping up with the news cycle because you can go out, as the English like to do on a regular basis, make a cup of tea and come back and something else has happened. I wonder if we could take a sort of a medium-term view of the last decade or so, or maybe a bit longer, noting that point that there's this sense, as with the church, that, to use that phrase, to seek a more perfect union, and that's an ongoing, never-ending process. Have there been changes to the framework as it has stood, and as it has grown in the 20th century? Have there been changes to that framework in recent times that, in your view, have the potential to alter our sense of what it means to be an American with other Americans? Natosha, what may I ask you to?
Yeah, as you're asking that question, of course, I'm always thinking, what are the things that help us to form and craft our identity as Americans? So, I mean, one of the, and Sally's mentioned it already, one of the greatest places where we all form our identity as Americans is in school, right? That's where we really become, we learn the Pledge of Allegiance in school, we learn that there's a constitution in school. I'm thinking elementary education, right? I mean, clearly we dive into it more deeply as we go further. And with what we're seeing in recent days, and I'm using days as in 1,000 years as a day in the Bible, right? As we see recently in this let's just say when we talk about this news cycle, which are so short-shrifted, there's such an attack on this education space. And it's intentional. And I think the conversations about how we form our identity begin very early on, and they often are informing what we call as history and what's not history, what we call truth, what's not truth, all of those components. So when I think of as Americans and how we form that identity, it also happens in churches, right? It also happens in community organizations. It happens in courtrooms when we look at that. So I'm trying to think about how we look at when we look at the conversation on the Supreme Court today, when we look at the conversation on where we are in education and higher education and the attacks that are happening in the higher education space. And some may not call them attacks. Some may call them righting some wrongs, however we talk about that. But I think in having conversations about how we begin to see this current moment, maybe we focus in on higher education. I mean, we have connections to Harvard, and seeing that as just a harbinger of kind of a place of either what's to come or how we have this battle in the space of higher education, and think about what's worthy, what's not worthy, what's acceptable, what's not acceptable. All that influences our sense of identity as Americans.
Yeah, I think there have been shifts in the last decade, not just to the law, but also in terms of attitudes of leaders and citizens across the country as well, in terms of the value of pluralism and how we achieve that. I mean, you can look at just a couple of cases. You were mentioning Harvard, the admissions case that went before the Supreme Court, challenging the use of race in any manner in admissions at Harvard. And one of the things that's so striking about that is that the court finds that essentially diversity is not a value worthy of protecting in higher education. And that starts to erode, I think, the mechanisms by which we seek to achieve this pluralistic society that we were founded on and we've promised to everyone. You see Shelby County, another example there in terms of voting. It seems like we are shifting toward analyzing things from a legal standpoint of, is it facially neutral? And if it must be facially neutral regardless of what the impact is from any of these decisions. And that's what Shelby did. So where you have states that historically have made it more difficult for people of color to vote, now regardless of what the practical implications are, it's that facial neutrality. And that, I don't think that would be happening unless we as a society were more willing to tolerate that, or in some instances with some people demand that. And I think that's part of what you see in the anti-DEI type of movement as well. You know, I know that was a topic of another discussion here, but you know, the law has not changed on diversity, equity, and inclusion. If you're not receiving federal funds. If you receive federal funds, there's an executive order that impacts that. But the fact of the matter is the law hasn't changed. What has changed is the willingness of leaders in business or academia or otherwise to stand up for what they actually believe in and do it in the face of people who are critical of it. And so that's the kind of, that to me, in a lot of ways, it's far more dangerous than anything that any court is going to do. It's because we are obeying in advance.
That's right.
To what we believe others, how others want us to behave or believe.
And I do think that's the opportunity for communities of faith, actually, in terms of how as communities of faith who live together in fellowship, who study together, who learn through our understanding of what humanity is and square that up against what we're seeing play out in terms of a legislative component. It's a really good opportunity for us to add a critical and loving eye to how we talk about it. So if I could, Simon gave us permission to kind of flow. Facially neutral. To many of us, because one of the components of our American identity is fairness, right? Equality, fairness, justice. Facially neutral sounds like where we should be going. When you hear that in and of itself, why wouldn't we want a facially neutral law? Why wouldn't we want a law that is objective rather than subjective? Why wouldn't we want that today? Based upon the history of our country. That's one of the things I think we typically don't unpack. Like and I'll throw my last little thing. Whenever we developed vaccines prior to the COVID vaccine, the vaccine always included a part of the virus that it was vaccinating us against, for the most part. This is not my lane, so if you're an epidemiologist, correct me. But for the most part, vaccines typically include a strain of the virus. It doesn't mean we get the flu vaccine and we get the flu, but it had some components of that virus to fight it, to ward it off. But now we want to give a vaccine to the problems we've had in this country with no acknowledgement of racism, of sexism, of any of the isms, right? That we're now with a facially neutral law supposed to maybe not correct for, but just move forward. And it's very hard to do that once there's been ill, violence, and a discrimination of humanity.
I think you just answered your own question there, Frank, more eloquently than I could have. But yes, the facial neutrality ignores the practical implications of both the history and current day, what that means to be facially neutral. So it has tremendous appeal, as you're saying. Who was it, Justice Roberts, who had said the way to end discrimination based on race is to stop discriminating based on race? I mean, that sounds rather naive given what the history of our country has been and where we still are today and what the ramifications of that history are for marginalized groups.
Yeah.
So I'd love to take that in a way as this question of origins and how we go back to it. The church keeps on telling its story, telling its ancient story, so we don't forget ourselves and forget who we are. And that the second framework I'd like to have us think about is the relationship, if this was our relationship to one another, our relationship to law in itself. And you may be really, we as in the church tend to get hearing all of this sort of narrative around 10 of the commandments, but our Jewish siblings have 613 commandments to wrangle over. And so much of that is about the nature of our socioeconomic relationships. There's beautiful laws about not reaping all the way to the edge of the field and leave some for the poor and the stranger. There are laws about forgiving debts every 7 years. But as a sort of theological perspective, the law is not intended to be a static thing. And I'm heading here to a question about, I guess, originalism, or our understanding of the Constitution. It's meant to be a dynamic thing, and we know that if you ever want to have a wonderful evening of seeing how other faith traditions form their faith leaders, go and watch some rabbis debating the scripture. And the room will be filled with people very loudly, almost sort of shouting across a table, because the nature of Torah, of law, is that it's an ongoing, living thing. And we see that in Jesus, often called a rabbi. This phrase that we hear in the Sermon on the Mount, you have heard it say, but I say. So within Christianity, particularly in the Episcopal Church, we often get criticized by some of our siblings in other parts of Christianity for picking and choosing what we like about the Bible, but really what we're trying to do is to respond to the Spirit. There's a dynamism inherent in our way of being Christian. And I want to pick up the theme of legal foundations and dynamism, asking where you see our relationship today to the Constitution in terms of Supreme Court rulings in recent years. Is our relationship to the Constitution changing in this country, do you think?
So con law with Lawrence Tribe, that was my professor for con law. And it was a class full of parables, and I don't know anything about what we learned in that class. I'm just kidding. But no, I think that, I don't think our relationship, I'll step out and kind of say this. I don't think our relationship to the Constitution is changing. I think we have always wrestled with the Constitution. I think some of the conclusions coming out of recent conversations before the Supreme Court are changing, but I don't think our relationship is changing. I mean, I think ideally the Constitution is also a living document, a living primer on how we as a country identify as Americans and how that affects our behavior. I do think that there is an overcorrection happening that is actually beginning to limit more of what this is my bias, I think the Constitution was put in place to provide in terms of freedom, justice, in terms of an active and engaged civic culture. I think of the Constitution also not just as a legislative document, but as a cultural development document for who we are. And I do think that that is changing.
And it's changed, if a different president had appointed the majority of the Supreme Court, we would be in a very different place right now. And how's that for stating the obvious, right? And I say that because I think it reflects just how difficult these questions are. It used to be just about everything important was decided with a 5-4 majority. I mean, that's shifted some now too. And I guess I would sort of go back to the answer I gave a minute ago. I think what you see in terms of a shifting with the Supreme Court and the Constitution is almost an ignorance of the reality of life in America today.
Right.
As opposed to a change in how the justices view the Constitution. Kind of this reflecting both their decisions with respect to voting, with respect to admissions in colleges, et cetera. And it's as if sort of if you're living in that bubble where life has always worked out for you just fine, and you have not experienced any of life in America when you are part of a minority, not just racial minority, but views or otherwise, then it may be kind of hard for you to wrap your head around the fact that we actually do need those protections. And that's why sort of going back to facial neutrality looks like that is answering the promise of our Constitution, when in fact in execution, at least in my view, it is not.
Yeah, and one of the things I've often done in my practice of law, and even in the mundane world of mortgage regulations, which I did quite a bit of, is always ask the why. So now this is getting to the spirit of the law conversation. Why is this law important? What was it intended to do? And that's one of the other elements of kind of the conversation of jurisprudence and our identity as Americans is the assumption of good faith. So if I'm assuming good faith of this particular piece of legislation, and we can't say that about every piece, then what is it actually intending to do? Then that begins to open up a conversation, debate, about what we see the law intending to do. And sometimes that can lead us, I think, to places where we are uniting folks, and other times it can lead us to places where we are marginalizing. But having those conversations about many of the laws is what we are seeing the Supreme Court. I don't even know that they have to debate on it, actually. At this point, they're not even debating. But what we, in its best case scenario, where we would see a body like the Supreme Court actually debating on the why and the spirit of the law, and get us to a place where we have a much more consistently driven opinions coming out of the Supreme Court.
I want to turn us, I'm going to see if we can get some time for questions before we close. I want to turn us to the final framework, and one that really came home for us at All Saints. And so that the final covenant is covenant of land. The covenant of Torah or law is what Moses receives. If you go to Jordan and climb up Mount Nebo, you look over, the tradition is you're looking over at the land that Moses saw and was promised. And it's always been a point of tension, because the challenge with the land is that there are people living in it already. And that has been from the ancient Canaanites to Palestinians on the Gaza Strip. There has been a bloody tension, a relationship to the covenant of land in terms of our biblical narrative. And there's been a bloody tension in terms of our relationship to land here in this country. And of course, it's not unique to this country. But the reason why it came home over the last year, of course, was particularly thinking about refugee communities, a key part of our identity and ministry here at All Saints. And I want to ask about, in a way, how other people around the world might look at us in terms of being a rules-based society. When they can turn on the news and see people under the auspices, whether it's the Immigration and Nationality Act, or the, as I understand it, more obscure Alien Enemies Act, which is something of a, as a layperson here, as a reach, but people being taken off the street by unidentifiable government agents, deported to foreign countries without due process. From a perspective around the world, so I'd find it hard to describe what's happening here to my relatives living elsewhere. Like, what's going on here? Well, it's hard to describe really, but I wonder if you could help us take a look back and is there something that is shifting sort of foundationally about us being a rules-based society? We felt that there was a call upon us to be the church. In the first part of this year, and we responded in this beautiful way to rally and be at the shoulder of people who we've known and loved for 3 decades and more here. Is something shifting? Is this an example that shows us that actually we are transitioning away from being a rules-based society? Are you hanging on with David Brooks, who's sort of like, you see him clinging, getting more and more, his hair's going whiter and whiter by the week on PBS NewsHour, trying to hang on to the idea that America will be a rules-based society in the end. Is there a paradigm shift happening here? Or the critique of that would be, no, that's alarmist. And there's not a paradigm shift. It's just part of the pendulum swing. It'll swing back the other way. So is there a shift of an era? Does this reveal a shift of an era for you in relationship to a rules-based society?
Well, I think it certainly is a shift away from a rules-based society. Whether it's a paradigm shift or not depends on, again, to state the obvious, whether it continues. And it all goes back to this idea, it seems to me, of, we're founded on this idea that we're a swirl, and that we originally viewed that as our strength. But now that is viewed as a threat by some. And so instead of welcoming those to this country who contribute to that swirl, Instead, we either shut the door, or if you come, you must assimilate and become like us. And look, I'm not so naive as to think that these views didn't exist among probably many Americans well before what's happened in the last few years. But the permission structure has changed in terms of saying it out loud and supporting it, and our leadership has obviously changed. And it's appealing to the worst instincts of Americans, and to me is a sign of real weakness, not strength. Whether this continues or not is really up to all of us. We're not going to have the same leader, and I don't mean to get political, but it's kind of hard not to in this. We're not going to have the same leader in the White House, presumably, at the end of this term. But the direction our country goes all depends on what we demand. And it's happening now because, frankly, we gave permission to that in the last election. So it's up to us.
I love the language permission structure. I would harshly say a law is only as good as it's enforced and as folks are held accountable. There is a clear breaking of law right now happening on our streets. All of the folks that are being detained and kidnapped by ICE agents, many of them are citizens. So it's a violation of the 14th Amendment. But back to what Sally said earlier, because there's, we as the American people have, I think, upon us, the burden of holding folks accountable. And so this is where we need a much longer conversation really quickly. But why is it that we don't hold certain people accountable? Why is it that we think some people are above the law? Why is it that the outcry, if there was a different person in office, perhaps even different race or different gender, would more than likely be a lot louder and different than what's happening now? Why do we give folks assumed ability to do whatever they want to do? Why are we not saying more? I mean, all of these whys are questions that people are asking outside of this country, looking at our country. But it's also, there's something that has hypnotized folks in this country. In a way. I mean, and none of us want to be the walking hypnotized. But we are, because we are buying into something that sounds familiar in an ancient ear, that says it's okay for this to proceed the way it's proceeding. We questioned Obama's citizenship and allowed that to take the airwaves. And yet we're seeing the violation of the very founding principles of this country, and we're staying quiet. So I don't know. I mean, I don't have all the answers as to why, but I want to know why. And I think if we can figure out the answers as to why are we being silent in this moment, allowing this to happen? Why are we allowing citizens to be terrorized and kidnapped and sent to other countries? Why are we allowing this to be the predominant okay in the common space, in the public spaces? I mean, if we can answer that question, maybe we can begin to have a healthier relationship with the Constitution, with the laws, and also allow for there to, I'm not saying that only one perspective should dominate. I'm actually saying let's have conversation between perspectives to figure this thing out.
So I want to offer a chance. Marcia, would you be able to